This is Stories of Impact, the art and science of human flourishing. In every episode, we travel the world to explore intersections of science and spirituality. I'm your host, writer Tavia Gilbert, and along with journalist Richard Sergey, every first and third Tuesday, we look through a new lens at old traditions, hear from new generations as they dream up innovative solutions, and learn new ways to make sense of modern life. Is science fundamentally in opposition to religion, or do they just have little to do with each other? Is the way you engage with science and religion informed by your core beliefs, or are your core beliefs informed by them? Do you think it's scientists or religious experts, or both, or neither, that are best equipped to help humans explore the meaning of life? People might find these questions to be provocative or controversial, but our guest in today's episode, science educator and researcher Dr. Barry Billingsley, was raised in a family culture of curiosity, so she's been asking these sorts of really big questions all her life.
I have family members who are in science, so we had quite a lot of discussion, and there were no questions that you couldn't ask. In fact, I think my family encouraged me to ask those questions.
Dr. Billingsley's question asking led her to study science education. She was passionate and insatiably curious, not only about science, but about everything. What excited her most as a young doctoral student on the cusp of starting her professional teaching career? She thought she'd get to explore with her students the big questions about humans' place in the universe. But when she got into the classroom, the reality surprised her.
I'd done a PhD that looked at how people think about bridging science and religion and reading up what scholars had said. And now I was a science teacher. So I was really excited by these big questions. I thought, fantastic, I'm here with young people. I know young people want to know all about this stuff. This is it. I'm going to be the teacher that can tell them. And as a science teacher, I found it remarkably difficult to do. Creating the space to make it happen in a schoolroom is incredibly difficult. You've got kids looking at the clock, wondering when you're going to get back on task and help them with the exam. You know that at any moment the bell will ring and they'll be off to their next lesson. It just doesn't fit comfortably in the format of what we have in science. And the big questions are just not there. Big questions, as we know, are not easy to answer. So they don't fit that box. And after a while, you learn not to ask the question.
Now a professor in science education and the director of the Learning About Science and Religion Center at Canterbury Christ Church University in Oxford, England, Dr. Billingsley, as devoted as she has been to young people's science education throughout her career as a researcher, has built a body of work critiquing the way science is traditionally taught.
Science lessons tend to focus on what we call recipe investigations. So these are investigations that teachers have perfected. You can get the equipment out, you can put it in front of the children. Small people can manage to get themselves from one end of the investigation to the other end with a reasonable chance of coming away with the sort of answer that you're expecting. As science teachers, we perfect these recipe investigations, and we then deliver a lot of them to the children. So the sorts of things that children are finding out are very established, well-rehearsed bits of content knowledge.
Dr. Billingsley thinks that kind of recipe investigation education leaves students with a fundamental misunderstanding of the scientific potential for deep knowledge and real exploration. She says that teaches students to assume that
just because they did an investigation and out fell an answer in about 20 minutes. And not only that, it was pretty similar to the answer that arrived at all the other tables. Children will assume that that's the nature of science, that you could take a question, you could do an experiment, you can walk away with a definite answer. So a huge misconception is that any question you like, give it to some scientists and they'll work it out.
If Dr. Billingsley was, early on, frustrated by her inability to create space for big questions in her science classroom, she was even more surprised to discover that her students behaved very differently in their religious education classes, which are part of the required curriculum in UK state-funded schools. It was in religious education that she saw kids begin to wonder about themselves and the universe.
I was asked if I would mentor an RE, so a religious education teacher, out of my science lesson and into their religious education lesson. They were like completely different people. Suddenly they could ask all those questions I wanted them to ask in my lesson.
What kinds of questions were the kids asking?
So there is creation and evolution. There's that sort of idea of how did we get here? But what they really want to know is what is their own experience of being human and how should they understand that? This age-old question, which is, are we really putting anything of ourselves into our own lives? Is there actually something in there that's a soul, if you want, that's kind of steering us through? Are we agents with free choice? Or are we slaves to our circumstances and the interaction that we have with our environment? Are we anything more than that? Or if you really analysed us, are we just a sort of a sum of patterns that you could understand and predict scientifically? I think those questions are more even than moral and ethical. They're really deeply philosophical. They're questions about how we should understand ourselves and what we can make sense of in the world to tell us what kind of people we are.
Siloing education, keeping science and religion separate, offering recipe investigations in the science silo, and opening the door to philosophical questions only in the religious education silo, wasn't just keeping kids from a true depth of understanding in either subject. The act of siloing itself, says Dr. Billingsley, has an early and long-term impact on the development of students' critical thinking.
It's really quite alarming how early on in their lives they can already tell you that it's science versus religion, long before they really know very much about what science or religion are necessarily saying. Just the level of entrenched compartmentalisation. Religion, they'll say, is opinions. Science is facts. And for them, the difference between the two classrooms is that science is there to tell you facts. Even if the teacher tolerates some opinions for a little while, eventually, in the children's words, the teacher will overrule and tell you what the fact is, what you're meant to put in the exam. Whereas in the religious education classroom, you can believe what you want. The children will even start to characterise the two teachers. So they say of their science teachers know a lot. They've probably got a master's, very well educated, not really interested in listening to you very much. They really just want to bat on and tell you equations. The religious education teacher, far more interested in your ideas, maybe doesn't know very much. And that, of course, is because in their experience, the religious education teacher isn't giving them an answer.
Dr. Billingsley doesn't only want to break down silos in education. She wants to help students better understand their teachers' points of view, not what they assume the teacher's point of view to be. How does she do that? By examining questions.
The children will suppose that the science teacher has a different stance, for example, to the religious education teacher. If in religious education you asked a question that's very amenable to science, you'd hopefully come out with the same answer. What happens if we move a question gradually from one that's very narrow and very amenable to science, and that's a phrase we use a lot, that's very amenable to science, as we gradually make that question bigger and bigger, and it gets closer and closer to what you might meet in the religious education classroom, so that they can see that actually it wasn't something special about those two things, it was something special about the question.
Dr. Billingsley wants children to understand that what questions they ask and how they ask them determines how expansive their explorations about the nature of the universe will be, whether in the science classroom or the religious education classroom.
If we only have exams that ask children to answer a very narrow set of questions, and we only have classrooms that are designed to teach a very narrow curriculum, as I say, as a teacher, you can really miss what the children just haven't picked up in the lesson. You can also miss the misconceptions and misperceptions that children have picked up. So it is, if you want, it's a bit of a Pandora's box. It's saying, look, you've only asked those very narrow questions and the children told you what you expected to hear. And so you think that they've understood, but they've really only understood something very little. And when you look at what they thought about, you're often quite alarmed. If the children had a really good grasp of the methods of science and they knew that the reason that God wasn't in the picture is because we'd narrowed down the question to the sort of questions that we can resolve using observations, they'd be able to say, okay, well, God wasn't in the picture because we weren't asking that sort of question. We weren't asking the sort of question where you would see God coming into the picture. If we broaden the question back out again, then we've got a space where we can start to see God coming into the picture. If we've only really asked questions about what happens when atoms interact with each other, well, we're not really going to see God at that level. But that thought process isn't happening in the science classroom. And then the science classroom isn't being referenced in the religious education classroom or the home, wherever religion is talked about.
She wants children to have the chance to go deeper, not only so they learn more about subject matter, but so that they gain epistemic insight, or knowledge about knowledge itself.
You don't very often have a lesson that begins with, well, today we're going to look at the limitations of science and try and think about all the questions that really science does not get us very far with answering. And because the big question isn't entertained, the science teacher doesn't know how the lesson they've taught has rubbed off on children's thinking about themselves as people, because we don't go there. We've got a curriculum and we've got an exam spec, and they are very small, contained questions that children learn to answer. So there's what we meant to teach the children. But what did we also teach them that we didn't actually realise we were teaching them in that process? And we call it the hidden curriculum.
Another part of the problem? Dr. Billingsley says the study of science doesn't mirror the process of actual science.
So children's experience in the science classroom isn't the same as scientists' experience working with frontier questions. It's almost like a conspiracy. We're in the business of showing children the established scientific knowledge that we have, and as long as that is what the purpose of the lesson is about, helping the children to get very quickly in 20 minutes to where somebody fantastic like Hooke got, a really great scholar after a considerable amount of thought. You've got 20 minutes to get them there. Clearly, you're going to get them there as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So the best thing to do when you get into your science classroom is to kind of close the door on everything that you thought about when you were in other classrooms or even in your everyday life, and just focus on what that science lesson is about. What's missing then from children's education is a chance to encounter those big questions, to notice all the thinking skills that you need when you think about a big question, to think about the power and limitations of science. So how far can science get you with that big question? What sort of a question can science address very well? What kind of a question can it not address so well? Those sorts of questions are just not being teased out for children. If we really are going to address this problem, and it is a problem, and one I think is hugely important and worth addressing, it's not a simple solution.
Historically, great thinkers were motivated to study science in order to discover the answers to questions that today stay siloed in religious education. But if we want science to have a thriving future, says Dr. Billingsley, we have to keep asking courageous and curious questions everywhere. We need to embrace multidisciplinary study, and we should learn from the past.
If we look at scholarship historically, those big questions have motivated all sorts of wonderful scholars. Newton, as we know, was inspired and motivated by his faith, and far from the only scientist to be inspired by faith. So if we cut out experience with those big questions, we're stopping children who would be motivated by them from looking into science from that perspective. We need children to be able to think outside the box and not see science as being the only port of call when they're trying to address a question. It could still be a port of call, but it might need to also have some of those other disciplines in there too. Your science informs your thinking. Science informs our thinking about every part of our lives. But your science is not going to get you all the way to an answer on those big questions. We need young people to be able to embrace the bigger question of what it means to be a person, so that they can really come to a good conclusion about where they want to go with that.
So Dr. Billingsley's research has focused on how to break down the barriers between science and religious classrooms to offer children more tools for understanding how they're learning, as well as what they're learning across all subjects.
Many subjects are interested in evidence. Religion is also interested in evidence. It's just that you can't always get that sort of observable, repeatable, measurable evidence that science prefers. So they're not the sorts of questions that you can easily bring science to. You can't always get that sort of evidence for those bigger questions. The most important thing of all is helping children to see that science and religion are mostly concerned with different sorts of questions, and that we use different sorts of methods to try and work out those different sorts of questions. Most children think science does help us with why questions, and science does seem to be able to help us to get answers. In the curriculum, it tells children that science is about observations. We start them on that idea very young. So science is about observing things. And not only that, but in science, we collectively observe. So we look at natural phenomenon, we look at something we can all see, and we collectively observe it, and we try and explain what we can see on the basis of more observations. And then if we write it up, other people ought to be able to see the same thing. They should see that natural phenomenon. They should see what we observed. They should be able to make sense of it the same way. When you think about the sorts of questions that you're asking in religion, they're really not often those sorts of questions. In fact, they might be a little bit more sometimes like history questions, where we're relying on testimony, what people said they experienced. In history, the way that we address that is we broaden out what we're willing to look at. So we also look at testimony. Is that eligible? No, testimony is not eligible in the science classroom, but it would be eligible in the history classroom, and it would also be eligible in the RE classroom, or the religious education classroom. A lot of what we've been looking at is how we teach children the thinking skills. And the thinking skills in all sorts of questions, not just the ones that you meet in the religious education classroom. We really do need to prioritise these big questions and find a proper space for them, work out where they fit.
Why is this so important?
The children in school at the moment, they're getting education in the specialist subjects. And the specialist subjects are each focused around, in many cases, a specialist discipline. So they're getting what we call the immersion in the discipline. And immersion in the discipline, for example, in science education, as I've highlighted, is to really take them to the bits of science that we can do best. So children will assume that science has a position because everything they've seen of science has been science speaking with confidence, science coming out with an answer. I think there's a missing thought in that discussion, which is that if we really want children to understand the nature of science, it becomes a lot easier to understand the nature of science when you can compare it with your other disciplines. If your only way of trying to think about the nature of science is from inside science, that's really hard.
What's the solution? It's not just to better educate the students, it's to better educate the educators.
We need to change what's happening at every point in the chain. We need to change how teacher education is working so that the teachers are getting support. The teacher educators need help. They haven't tried to manage these big questions before. The children coming through school need help. We have to work on all the parts of the system at the same time to try to get out of the entrenched compartmentalisation that we're in at the moment. So we've shown that there are significant thinking skills missing in children's thinking. They don't only apply to questions bridging science and religion, they apply to questions bridging science and the humanities. In fact, they apply to questions bridging science and everything. So we've shown that those thinking skills are missing, that they need to be taught in schools. We've shown the reasons for wanting to put them in schools to incentivise a new group of scientists and engineers to come through. We've shown lots of reasons for investing, as it were, in this area of education that are not only focused on enabling young people to see religious answers. So by bringing that to policymakers and schools, the next step has to be to get schools, policymakers, curriculum documents, to start teacher training indeed, all starting to take the multidisciplinary approaches on board and build it into schools.
Dr. Billingsley says that the first steps can be just building awareness.
So there's sorts of dialogues that you can set up just by giving those teachers a bit more information about each other's curriculum subjects. Some of the things that we can do are just highlighting to the teachers some of the distinctions and similarities between their curriculum documents, where we've tried to come up with some ideas for what would be called classrooms with permeable walls.
In fact, Dr. Billingsley believes that making classrooms more permeable is a big part of what's an obvious solution.
Since big questions are of themselves very multidisciplinary, the solution is not just to give it to one classroom. If you could just put the religious education lesson with the science lesson, if you could put the two teachers with all of their expertise together, what an incredible setting that would be for school children.
But, like the rude awakening she got as a young teacher, she recognizes that this idea isn't quite as easy as it seems.
So I'm here as a researcher saying, wouldn't it be great if the history teacher could watch the science lesson and the science teacher could watch the history lesson? But in practice, they're both teaching at the same time. And teachers will tell you that even if they want to be collaborative, it's really hard. So the timetable is one barrier. The curriculum is another barrier, because the curriculum tells us not only what to teach, but also what to test as well. I think what we really need, therefore, is a curriculum that can find a way of recognising those cross-discipline critical thinking skills.
She recognizes other social and pedagogical barriers in trying to get public schools and school teachers to adopt multidisciplinary learning. Not everyone is as enthusiastic as she is.
I think one of the huge challenges for teachers in those very pure, if you want, discipline subjects, so the historians, the scientists, it's just accepting that they will need to know a little bit about each other's subjects. And this is just from one teacher, but it gives you an extreme part of the picture. One teacher said of their own experience of school teaching, this is a science teacher, we're over here, they're over there. That's the way we like it. So I think for some teachers, that idea of engaging with other disciplines as well, that's a big step.
However, once educators and administrative leaders better understand Dr. Billingsley's ideas about a multidisciplinary approach to big questions across classrooms, there is buy-in.
Once you demonstrate what is missing, and then you show what the children can gain by putting it back in, those teachers, those policymakers, they want to come on board and they want it to happen too.
And the world won't wait. As society becomes more technological, we need educational institutions to implement interdisciplinary learning where they can also consider the really big philosophical questions.
The word is out there in schools, and schools are looking for how to make those changes. Not only because of the work that we've been doing, I think what we're doing resonates with a lot of things that are happening around us. So we've got a shortage of science teachers and we've got a shortage of engineers. We've got a bit of a better understanding now that we need to have that broader thinking as well, just to get more young people into science. If we don't get more young people into science, we don't get more science teachers coming out the other side. So there's sort of pipeline issues that are putting a bit of pressure on. There's recognition of the importance of the big questions themselves. There's the advance of technology, and so the questions are increasingly pressing. More people talking about whether robots can take over the weapons and how we should work out something to stay on top. Because of all of those factors, I think that the world is absolutely looking for the solutions. And if we can come up with those solutions, the market is there for them.
And if the need is there, then at what age should we begin to prepare students to confidently and curiously ask big questions, no matter what classroom they're in?
I started working with an early years teacher, and she was asked that very same question. When do you think children should begin thinking about big questions? She said, well, from birth, really. So that is now my answer. I think that's fantastic. Absolutely, from birth. I think from the beginning, we are multidisciplinary thinkers. And actually, what we've done in education is teach children not to think about big questions. I think children are thinking big questions all the time. But in schools, we're teaching them not to ask those sorts of questions. I think the children were already asking the big questions. I don't think there ever was a day, if you look at the history of humanity, when we were not asking big questions.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with another new episode, part 2 of Big Questions in the Classroom. In the meantime, please share the Stories of Impact podcast, and we'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch at storiesofimpact.org. This has been the Stories of Impact podcast with an interview by Richard Sergey, written and produced by Tavia Gilbert for Talkbox Productions, music by Alexander Filipiak, mix and master by Kayla Elrod, executive producer Michelle Cobb. The Stories of Impact podcast is generously supported by Templeton World Charity Foundation.